I don't think that we of the left can develop an accurate analysis unless we have a holistic analysis. I don't think that we can really understand West Asia nor the Ukraine unless we understand other pressure points, the Sahel, and indeed every aspect of the world. I would say that we really need more global efforts. Uh, I salute the regional efforts. I salute the local and grassroots efforts. But ultimately, when we're face to face with such a powerful and formidable and gargantuan enemy, we would be remiss if we failed to bulk up and try to organize across borders, organize across political boundaries, because one of the lessons of history is that when we've overthrown past monsters, I think slavery, for example, which was a major characteristic of this small planet in the 19th century and even into the 20th century, there were worldwide anti-slavery organizations. We need a resuscitation and a revival of worldwide anti-imperialist organizations.
All right. Good day, everyone. We are here again with our very favorite professor, Professor Gerald Horne from the University of Houston. I don't think you really need an introduction. Gerald Horne has written lots of books about black activism, you name it, South Africa, white supremacy, etc., etc. And we often talk to you, Professor Horne, about global imperialism and the things that are going on. And we wanted to talk to you about Africa today. In particular, some specific developments in Africa that seem to not get a lot of attention in the so-called anti-imperialist sphere, or our friends on the left, you could say, over in the West. And my first question that I have for you is actually about a very interesting guy, a new phenomenon in Africa called Ibrahim Traoré. And we wanted to ask you, who is Ibrahim Traoré and how important is he for the global movement against imperialism?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, it's if what you're saying is accurate, and I have no reason to disbelieve you, that is to say that within the North Atlantic left, there is an abysmal ignorance of events in Africa that's unfortunate and tragic in light of the fact that many scholars and analysts, including Walter Rodney, Eric Williams of Trinidad and Tobago, have pointed out that the capitalism that now is implanted in the North Atlantic community was built not least upon enslavement of Africans, particularly the capitalism of the United States of America, of Great Britain, of France, of the Iberian nations, Spain and Portugal in particular. And of course, there was a knock-on effect in other European countries. I mean, for example, uh, Denmark was involved in the African slave trade, for example. Sweden was involved in establishing settlements in North America that led to the dispossession of the indigenous. So
The
it's
Dutch,
really
let's not
unfortunate.
forget the Dutch.
Oh, sorry.
Don't let them off the hook.
Sorry about that. Not intentional, I assure you. So, in any case, that leads us to Mr. Traoré, who is a young military officer who has made waves of late in Burkina Faso, not least because Burkina Faso, which is just north of Ghana in West Africa, is allied with the alliance of Sahel States, which also includes Mali and Niger. And knocking on the door of late has been Chad. And I would suspect that there might be other possible entrants into that alliance as well. Mr. Traoré, of course, is building upon the legacy bequeathed to him by the late assassinated leader Thomas Sankara, who passed from the scene in 1987 or thereabouts. in part or in large measure because he fell victim to a plot from one of his erstwhile comrades. Speaking of the succeeding leader, Blaise Compaoré, who turns out was in the pocket of France. And that there hangs a tale because you may have noticed that Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali are all former members of what used to be called French West Africa. There has been a very negative backlash in that part of Africa against France because of its vampire-like tendencies. Indeed, you can say there is a direct relationship between the rise of the Sahel states and their attempt to forge positive relations with Cuba, Russia, and China, and the counterreaction to France. However, despite the hopeful legacy bequeathed by Mr. Sankara, which includes women's rights, includes anti-corruption, includes building infrastructure, particularly roads, we should realize that the Sahel states, and particularly Burkina Faso, are not out of the woods by any means. For example, as we speak, there is a draining, well, what's oftentimes referred to as an insurgency by religious zealots who purport to be Muslims, who are killing on a regular basis cadre in the three Sahel states. There is reason to suspect that they're receiving external assistance, particularly from the United Arab Emirates, which cast in a new light the recent visit by U.S. President Donald J. Trump to the UAE. I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall when he was having conferences with the leadership of the UAE, because in light of the fact that the New York Times has reported that the Trump regime will be closing down consulates and embassies throughout the African continent, if that proves to be accurate, and I'm not sure if it will, given the fact that U.S. imperialism is keenly interested in the raw materials of Africa, for example, the uranium of Niger, the gold of Mali, to cite two examples amongst many. But in any case, if that proves to be accurate, I think that that will uplift and elevate the role of the UAE as the kind of proxy. And of course, is playing a very damaging and horrific role as we speak in Sudan, which is a neighbor of Chad. Recall that perhaps the major bleeding wound on planet Earth today is probably taking place in Sudan, although there's significant competition, I'm afraid to say, from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, at least the eastern section. And so um, we should not ignore the events in Burkina Faso because quite a bit is at stake. And I should also point out in this context that the Sahel states, including Burkina Faso, have been forced into uncomfortable compromises of late. That is to say, that they are all landlocked. And in order to get an outlet to the sea, they've just cut a deal with Morocco, Morocco being a major placeman of the North Atlantic countries. Recall that it's a signatory of the notorious Abraham Accords brokered in the Trump 1.0 regime, which calls for warming relations with Israel. If I'm not mistaken, the UAE also has been a signatory to the Abraham Accords. But part of the deal with regard to getting an outlet to the sea via Morocco likely will involve a retreat with regard to solidarity with Western Sahara. Recall this Western Sahara, a former Spanish colony. Spain evacuates in 1975. Morocco makes a claim. Western Sahara is blessed with phosphates, which is very necessary for the production of fertilizers, in turn necessary for booming agriculture. And the Polisario, the sole legitimate, authentic representative of the people of Western Sahara, is backed in turn by Algeria. And so Therefore, its complicated relations between Algeria and Morocco likely will complicate relations between Algeria and Mali, for example. And to show that this is not necessarily some sort of fluke, you might have noticed that Kenya, uh, President Ruto, has just inked a similar deal with Morocco with regard to acknowledging its alleged jurisdiction over Western Sahara. And naturally, France and the North Atlantic countries are in Morocco's corner because it's carried so much water for U.S. imperialism and for North Atlantic imperialism over the decades. President Ruto was under pressure because he recently made a visit to China and came back with a bag of goodies, which was displeasing to U.S. imperialism. So I guess he feels that sending Kenyan police officers to Haiti at the behest of U.S. imperialism to try to combat the so-called gangs in that Caribbean country, that was not sufficient to win him plaudits in Washington. So he's now bent over backwards to please Washington by recognizing this illegitimate claim of Morocco to Western Sahara. At the same time, Mr. Traoré has received negative attention in the North Atlantic countries because of his trips to Moscow. In fact, he was in Moscow on May 9th, the holiest day in the Russian political calendar, marking the victory over fascism in Europe in 1945. Also there on May 9th were President Lula of Brazil, President Xi of China, Diaz-Canel of Cuba, Maduro of Venezuela, etc. So he was, in my estimation, in good company. He won many hearts in Moscow by addressing folks in Russia. Now, whether or not he speaks Russian, I'm not able to say. He might have just done a crash course in the day or week before so that he could make a splash. But in any case, once again, speaking Russian in Moscow is not the way to win friends on Wall Street or influence the White House. And so I think it's incumbent upon the anti-imperialist community, the North Atlantic left community, to extend solidarity to Burkina Faso and to the Sahel states, because if the fondest wish of U.S. imperialism is granted, all three of those regimes will be overthrown. And in that context, I should mention that when the Nigerian regime came to power a couple of years ago, that there was an ominous threat from Nigeria, the powerhouse of the continent, to invade. And in fact, President Tinubu had recently been inaugurated. Of course, he has a checkered career. You may recall that he once lived in the United States of America. He fled in the 1970s with various charges hanging over his head. The rumor during the Biden administration, when this controversy was playing out, was that Vice President Harris had threatened to release rather indicting documents about Mr. Tinubu. And rather than see that happen, he started to threaten Niger. Another country we will have to watch as we tend to uplift solidarity with the Sahel states is Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, under President Ouattara, perhaps France's closest comrade on the African continent, which is really saying something since they have quite a few. And recall that it was about a decade or so ago when there was an electoral controversy in this cocoa-producing nation on the western coast of Africa, involving the current incumbent, Mr. Ouattara, who has, shall we say, seen his best days and years. His combatant was Laurent Gbagbo. French paratroopers landed in Cote d'Ivoire, bundled up Laurent Gbagbo and his spouse, and sent them off to The Hague to stand trial at the International Criminal Court, or as some might have it, the International Caucasian Court, given its proclivity to focus unduly upon leaders in the African continent. And Mr. Ouattara has been in office ever since, despite stiff challenges. There is a rumor. Some Ivorians I know say it's not a rumor, that it's fact, but let me present it to you here, that in his office that there is a trap door that he can escape peasants with pitchforks if they're knocking on his door that leads to a tunnel that allows him to escape into the French embassy, for example. And interestingly enough, for what it's worth, his spouse is French. His most recent competitor, Mr. Thiam, who you may recall that name, Thiam, because he was recently bounced out of Credit Suisse in Switzerland, a major arm of finance capital, on various charges. So he decided to come back to Cote d'Ivoire to run for office. And of course, Mr. Ouattara said that he cannot challenge him, and that's held up in the courts thus far. But interestingly, I mentioned that because his most recent spouse, speaking of Mr. Thiam, is a Black American. And Mr. Ouattara, his spouse, is France. And so in some ways, this was seen as a contest between France and the United States. And you can see that contest manifesting throughout West Africa. And perhaps we can go into that at your leisure.
Right. So I have one follow up, and I think also Peter wants to ask a question. And that touches on something you have often emphasized, and I totally agree with that. So we talk about how Africa is a bit absent in the anti-imperialist sphere in the West, at least, and in leftism, and that touches on that lack of internationalism that we still see. That is seems to be a really big problem, and that also brings me to, and I don't know if you have an answer to that. Feel free to be honest about that, but. I also see that problem among anti-imperialist resistance in sections of the world. What I'm trying to say is that, for example, Ibrahim Traoré is waging a very similar battle as, for example, the resistance in West Asia. So I'm wondering, like, for example, you have groupings like Hezbollah, of course you have Iran. How much are they actually cooperating or working with somebody like Ibrahim Traoré? Why are they not joining forces here? It seems also fractured to me. Is my observation correct? Do you have any idea about that?
I'm afraid to say that your observation is likely correct. Uh, if there is cooperation, they're keeping it a secret, and perhaps that's wise because that would outrage and incense the United States in particular. At the same time, of course, I am aware of the fact that the Sahel diplomats are trying to take advantage of the contradictions between and amongst various external forces. I mean, for example, reference what I said a moment or two ago about a threatened invasion of Niger by Nigeria. Uh, the Turks, who have been playing an increasingly muscular role in Africa, recall their role in Libya, for example. Let's not even get into their role in Syria. In Somalia, they're the power behind the throne, doing everything from involvement in garbage disposal to airport security to medical care, for example. This is building upon the hundreds of years of legacy of the so-called Ottoman Empire, which only went into collapse in the aftermath of World War I, a scant century ago. And President Erdogan obviously is trying to revive the kind of neo-Ottomanism, which once played a significant role in North Africa, uh, including Egypt, not to mention many African nations with predominantly Muslim populations. And so, once again, I am not aware of significant networks that would link, for example, the Sahel states with some of the combatants in West Asia. But then again, that may just be because they're keeping it close to the vest, but I'm not sure in any case.
I have a question, a bit more like epistemological, like how people can find out reliable information about what's going on in the Sahel. I'm doing an experiment now, and I'm looking at different media frames about the Alliance of Sahel States. And it's very easy to find in the English language the kind of dominant, leave aside what we'd want to call them, but the dominant narratives are they usually start with, oh my God, democracy is in crisis in the Sahel. There are coups for after such a long time of elected leaders. There was a successful counterterrorism operation there with France's help and the US's help, and now that's jeopardized. What are the other common themes? Um, they're bringing in Russian mercenaries, so they're allowing Russian influence in the heart of Africa, and so the whole gist of the frame is what's going on in the Alliance of Sahel States is this horrible development, counter-democratic, anti-democratic, in bed with Russia, part of Russia's nefarious plans for the world. But when it comes to finding counter frames, I found it a lot more difficult to find media outlets that provide any different story other than that. I mean, you can find them, but it takes a lot of searching. So for people who are interested in staying abreast of developments in the Sahel, where would you recommend that they go for good, journalistic work?
Well, I visit every morning and have been doing it for years, allafrica.com, which is an aggregation site. It presents various news items from various African countries. Um, the perspectives generally are okay, I would say. Of course, one should always read critically. Some years ago, I was reading on a regular basis news items coming directly from the United Nations. Now, either they dropped that service or they dropped me. But when I was reading it, I found it to be very useful and very informative. Perhaps it's still functioning. With regard to Substack, uh, there's the Substack of William Minter, Minter, who is a long-term activist in the United States, mostly focused on Southern Africa, although he ventures north from time to time and generally has a progressive perspective. And then I look at other particular sites from, I mean, for example, I used to live in Zimbabwe. And so I read the Zimbabwe Herald, which you can usually find. And the Zimbabwe Herald tries to cover not only the South, but also, since it's faced a kind of diplomatic isolation because of land reform, it also tries to reach out to sister and brother countries like the Sahel states that are facing a similar kind of diplomatic isolation. And likewise, the Mail and Guardian of South Africa, which is sort of a liberal publication, but as long as you keep that in mind, you can read their articles against the grain and ferret out useful intelligence. And given the fact that South Africa, alongside Nigeria, has the most robust economy on the continent, and the Mail and Guardian is probably the leading uh, liberal publication, at least in South Africa, it's worth a look. And I would say the same thing for the Daily Maverick of South Africa as well. So there are places where one can garner information. And I won't even get into the various podcasts because they're so time consuming that you may wind up. It's easy, to, of course, to read and skim. It's hard to skim a podcast, for example.
Yeah.
So, to jump back a bit about Ibrahim Traoré. So, how is his internal politics actually perceived? Is he also very popular among his own population? Is he doing reforms that are promising? Do you have any idea about that?
Well, yes, I would say so. But the problem is, once again, this religious insurgency, it's very serious. It's very bloody. It's very bestial. It has all of the regimes on the back foot. I think one of the reasons why Mr. Traoré has spent so much time in Moscow and why Peter is reading these stories about Russian forces in the Sahel states is because the regimes feel that they need help, and they do need help. But I think the program that I host, Freedom Now on KPFK FM in Los Angeles, which then is transferred to the Activist News Network, we did some interviews with activists in Burkina some months ago. You can probably find it online. And at least the activists that we were interviewing, who, of course, are of the left, they were highly supportive of the regime despite the impediments delivered by this religious insurgency, which, by the way, is spreading even to Cote d'Ivoire. It's spreading to Ghana because, of course, Burkina borders Ghana. In fact, Lieutenant General Michael Langley of AFRICOM, the mailed fist of the U.S. Pentagon, has expressed concern, interestingly enough and hypocritically enough, about the spreading of this insurgency. I think he
So
feels
he
that
can
it may
build
threaten.
bases. So he can build bases. So he
Well,
can
plus
build
he feels
military
that it may
bases.
threaten U.S. allies. And of course, it gets caught up in the contradictions because when Niger had its change of regime and then booted out the French, the Yankees thought that they could take advantage of the French absence by moving in, so to speak. I mean, there's this entire contestation between French imperialism and U.S. imperialism uh, that is ever present in Africa. In fact, it's spreading beyond Africa. It's something in terms of developing a holistic global analysis we're going to have to keep track of. What I mean by that is President Macron of France is on his way to Greenland to buck up the Danish colonists in the face of the threat from Mr. Trump to annex Greenland. Uh, Mr. Macron was welcomed the first foreign visit of the newly installed Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney. Instead of going to visit the King of Canada, King Charles III, that's one of his titles, in London, his first visit was to France. Mr. Macron recently spoke in Southeast Asia, trying to say that the folks there should not lean to the United States, should not lean to the Russia-China alliance, but should lean to the French-led or the alleged French-led forces. And so they're also contesting U.S. imperialism in Africa, which goes back to at least 1956 with the Suez Crisis, the piratical attack by France, Britain, and Israel on Nasser's Egypt over control of the Suez Canal. After Washington and Moscow objected, they were forced to retreat. Britain took one stance in response, which was tying itself to the apron strings of Uncle Sam. France tries to develop independently, and of course, in that vein, comes into conflict with U.S. imperialism over its colonial war in Algeria, with the then Senator John F. Kennedy expressing objections to French adventurism in North Africa. Many adopted the naive conclusion that that was showing that U.S. was moving towards anti-colonialism, but it was actually trying to elbow aside France so it could more easily exploit the natural gas of Algeria. And then, of course, France recognizes the People's Republic of China well before the United States does. So to return to your first question, I don't think that we of the left can develop an accurate analysis unless we have a holistic analysis. I don't think that we can really understand West Asia nor the Ukraine unless we understand other pressure points, the Sahel, and indeed every aspect of the world. I mean, in order for a physician to give an adequate and accurate diagnosis, they not only should be a specialist with regard to your nose, for example, they should be a specialist with regard to the whole body. And that's what we should aspire towards, at least.
Yeah, we should
Yeah,
have some
imperial
Chinese
planners.
medicine instead of Western medicine. Some Chinese medicine instead of Western medicine.
Okay, yeah, that's
And
another metaphor.
and imperial planners do the same thing. They don't discriminate. They look at the entire world. Well, they discriminate on the basis of where there are resources that they can exploit and political pressure that they want to exert. But yeah, we could take a lesson from the imperial planners and focus on the entire world. I'm wondering though if you could just speak briefly on the initial economic policies implemented in the Alliance of Sahel States. You mentioned that they're all three are landlocked. They're small markets relatively. If you're going to industrialize, you really need a much bigger market. So, people who want to see the African continent industrialized want to see a bigger internal market being created. What do you know what sorts of policies that they're trying to implement in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger since the left-leaning coups? Is there any movement towards trying to, I've heard, I think in the processing of some minerals, they want to bring the high value added procedures domestic so that of course they can capture more of the gains rather than just ship raw materials to France or wherever. Do you have a sense of the extent or the initial success of these economic policies?
Well, let's start with Niger, for example. What they're trying to do is leverage their major export earner. In Niger's case, the case would be uranium, which traditionally has gone almost exclusively to France to power electricity in French homes. Before the regime change, France was paying a pittance for this valuable commodity. With the change of regime, France is paying more, which on the one hand is outraging some in France, but on the other hand brings more revenue to the Nigerian budget, which allows for better expenditure on education and healthcare in the first instance. In Mali, for example, uh, gold is a major commodity amongst other precious metals, and Canada is a mining superpower, as well as Australia, and both have had major investments in Mali. Of late, what has raised the ire of many in the North Atlantic community has been the fact that the Malian authorities have, in fact, detained some of the executives from these mining superpowers unless and until their companies rework contracts, or as the Malians would say, observe contracts that have been negotiated that would allow for more revenue to come in to the Malian treasury in Bamako, which then again would allow for more expenditure on education and healthcare. But once again, this raises a number of points. One is that one does not have to be a keen student of history to recognize that when small countries begin to demand more revenue for their major export earners, particularly when we're talking about commodities like uranium and gold, uh, that does not necessarily win plaudits in the North Atlantic community. Of course, it leads to all manner of diabolical plots. You probably read about the various plots against Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. And at the same time, because of the pressure that they're under, that then oftentimes forces these uncomfortable compromises. For example, the one I just mentioned with regard to Morocco. And so, in some ways, what they're experiencing in many ways is a kind of replay of what other nations have experienced. I think of Cuba, for example, 90 miles from the shores of South Florida, which since 1959 has been trying to build socialism under unremitting pressure from the United States of America, including the fact that under the late leader Fidel Castro, there was something like almost 700 assassination attempts by US imperialism, including some real wacky ones, like poisoning his toothpaste, for example. making sure that he would smoke exploding cigars, for example. And so that particular playbook has not been deep sixed. If anything, there are new pages in the playbook that are being dusted off for malign and malignant use against the Sahel states.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So the final question before we wrap up, Professor Horne, is about that holistic approach that you just talked about. If we want to win over, or at least we want to be victorious on the left and in the anti-imperialist sphere, we need to first think about a holistic approach to imperialism, and I guess we also need a holistic solution. And when you were talking about all these religious zealots that are in Africa, there's a lot of Muslim extremism and funded by Gulf states, which of course are indirect proxies of the United States. That always gets back to a thing that I often highlight, and that has also been highlighted by Professor Michael Hudson, who we had on, about the fact that we have one big major issue, and that is the dominance of the U.S. dollar in the globe, in global trade, global as a global reserve currency, and I think that is one of the major hurdles to beat imperialism, because it gives the United States this endless stream of funding for religious extremism all over the world, for unrest all over the world, to every time oust promising leaders out of promising leaders that rise up in a country. You immediately start funding death squads, extremism, NGOs that have propaganda and all that stuff. So I think the dollar is a major hurdle for us simple anti-imperialists to be successful. My question is, do you agree? That's not, of course, number one. And number two is, are there any other holistic solutions that we should look at? Because it sometimes feels so hopeless for us against such a major power we're up against.
Well, of course, I agree. And I think that we need a resuscitation and a revival of worldwide anti-imperialist organizations. At one time, there were a number of exemplars of that trend, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the retreat of socialism, you saw a weakening of those kinds of organizations. I mean, to cite one example amongst many, during the heyday of the anti-apartheid movement, pre-1994, there were a number of discrete, disparate organizations worldwide that campaigned with regard to Southern African liberation and apartheid. And we would meet periodically in Portugal, in Puerto Rico, in Africa, in Tanzania, for example. But we need a revival and resuscitation of those sorts of organizations, which of course would not only focus on the Sahel, but would focus on the fate of Africa's last colony, as it's often billed, speaking of Western Sahara, would focus on reparations for the victims of the descendants of genocide in Namibia, the Nama and Herero people, the first victims of genocide in the 20th century at the hands of Berlin, 1904 to 1908. Berlin has turned a cold shoulder towards paying reparations claims, although they paid reparation claims to Israel, even though it did not exist at the time of the Holocaust, concluding in 1945, Israel coming into existence a few years later. There might be an opportunity for that kind of worldwide solidarity coming up in September 2025, when there will be a historic face-to-face summit between the Caribbean community, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, etc., and the African Union, 4 dozen plus strong countries, having a face-to-face summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, September 2025. There will be a number of Black American delegations going. as well. And a key item on the agenda would be reparations, for example, what I just referenced with regard to Namibia. But inevitably, when you get these sorts of folks around the table, other issues arise. And I think that they will arise because we expect delegations from Palestine, for example, to attend. Of course, since Addis is a African capital, we expect delegations from China and Russia and other friends from around the world. So I would say that we really need more global efforts. I salute the regional efforts. I salute the local and grassroots efforts. But ultimately, when we're face to face with such a powerful and formidable and gargantuan enemy, we would be remiss if we failed to bulk up and try to organize across borders, organize across political boundaries, because one of the lessons of history is that when we've overthrown past monsters, I think slavery, for example, which was a major characteristic of this small planet in the 19th century and even into the 20th century, there were worldwide anti-slavery organizations and who were meeting periodically, particularly in London, after London came on board post-1807 with banning the African slave trade and post-1833 with banning slavery itself. And so we need to learn those lessons of history, and I'm confident that we will be able to do so.
I think that's a great way to end off. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Good luck.
You too.
Thank you, and we will send you the
nice,
link.
Nice Guyabera, by the way. I just got
Say
back
that
from.
again? Oh,
Nice,
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي انا حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي تكتيكي تكتكتيكي